In the mid-70s, the show appeared on TV that immediately connected with hundreds of thousands of people that watched it. It was a comedy about a man named Tom, who when he turned 40 was no longer able to take seriously his job as a designer of plastic toys for breakfast cereals. So he and his wife Barbara adopt what they called a self-sufficient lifestyle while staying in their suburban house. They turn their front and their back gardens into allotments. They grow fruit and vegetables. They have chickens and pigs they call Pinky and Perky, a goat and a cockerel. They generate their own electricity from methane from animal waste and also attempt to make their own clothes. The show was, of course, The Good Life. Tom and Barbara Good and their long-suffering neighbours Margot and Jerry Ledbetter. And the reason it was so popular was because that feeling of the good life resonated with so many people. That life itself could, through simplifying wants and needs, reach a state of perpetual fulfilment, and all within suburbia. This then was the hope that the show gave, that despite people's own circumstances and troubles, making simple adjustments to one's own life was the key to the good life. The title of the show said it all. And that's what film and TV producers do. They come up with names and titles that connect with us on subjects that affect us all. So this morning, welcome to Real, where we're taking titles straight off the TV reel, applying biblical truths and principles, and bringing them to life as real topics for our daily lives. And of course, this morning we're starting off with the good life. If you ask anybody just what the good life is, you'll probably get just as many different answers. The thing is though, what comprises the good life for us today may even possibly be different tomorrow. Yesterday it was a cup of tea in bed and a hot water bottle. Today it's maybe sitting quietly in a chair with a good book and a bit of sunshine. You ever watched a show called Where the Wild Men Are? It's a fascinating documentaries about people in different parts of the world who are either living off the grid or in some sort of isolated or wilderness environment. Different people in different countries with different ways of living. However, the thing they all have in common is the general idea that the good life for them is connected with living as close to nature as possible whilst being as far away from other people as possible. In a strange sort of way, it almost seems to work. However, the true cost of isolation for them isn't fully known. Plus, it's contrary to what John Donne famously wrote back in the 1600s. No man is an island, separate unto himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, part of the main. And that's the avenue we're going to explore with Scripture this morning. What we'll find is that not only do we have an inbuilt interconnectedness to other people, but also that the good life is to be lived with others and for God. The truly good life comes from having God's blessing upon us, particularly in the area of healthy relationships. In fact, God's blessing is inseparable from having healthy relationships. 1 John 4:20 bluntly says, if we say we love God but we hate our brother, we're liars. Because if we do not love our brother whom we have seen, we cannot love God whom we've not seen. Being rightly related to God and to others sums up the message of the Bible. Matthew 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind and all your soul, and love your neighbour as yourself. Good life equals good relationships. However, the key is to keep the levels right. And there are at least 6 levels of relationship. There's God, spouse, self, children, church, work, others, and the list goes on. And unless you get the order of priority right, our lives get out of balance. And the happiness, or the good life as we call it, eludes us. Spend too much time at work, everything else is out of kill zone. Too much time on family or self or others, and our relationship with God suffers. The good life is a life tied up with good relationships. Open and honest relationships are the key to happy relationships. A group of women were at a seminar called How to Live in a Loving Relationship with Your Husband. The women were asked, how many of you love your husband? All the women raised their hands. They were then asked, when was the last time you told your husband you loved him? Some women said today, a few said yesterday, and some said they couldn't remember. The women were then told to take out their mobile phones and text their husband, I love you, darling. Next, the women were instructed to exchange their mobile phones with the person next to them and read aloud the text messages they got back in response. Some of the replies are, who the heck is this? Yes, I love you too. What's wrong? What now? Have you wrecked the car again? Okay, how much do you need? My personal favourite? Your mother's coming to stay with us, isn't she? The good life is the life tied up in good relationships. But how can life be good, particularly when life itself seems to be so full of problems, like right now, with COVID and all the complications that that's brought to us? The book of 1 Peter was written to people who were being persecuted and in desperate need of encouragement. They may not have had COVID or lockdowns, but they knew all about living life with massive problems. And to help them, and us as well, Peter outlines some basic instruction in a small section for living and loving the good life in the midst of trouble. On Peter 3:8-12, I'll read it. To sum up, all of you, be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly loving, compassionate and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead, for you were called for the very purpose that you would inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. The good life is the life lived with good relationships, but it's also the life lived with the right attitude and actions. And Peter mentions 5 character qualities in verse 8. The first one is harmony. A harmonious person seeks to get along with others. They're not self-willed, demanding your own way, and judging those who don't go along with them. They're a team player who considers the other person's perspective and gives others room to be different. They accept people as Christ accepts them. They know the difference between biblical absolutes, which must not be compromised, and then the grey areas where there is a latitude for difference. In other words, what is prescriptive and what is descriptive. The right compromise, being willing to accept that it doesn't always have to be our own way. And sympathy, it says. The dictionary calls it affected by and entering into what others are feeling. Paul says something similar in Romans 12:15. We are to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Let the sufferings of others touch our own emotions. We have to be sensitive to how we would feel if we were in the other person's place. Because God made us all with emotions, and healthy relationships must take into account other people's feelings. He says brotherly love. The mafia call themselves family, which they are. However, Christians beat them to that label a long time before the Cosa Nostra ever came into being. As believers, we're members of the same family, the family of God. But unlike gang-warring families, we must show brotherly love to those outside of the family of God, since we're all members of the human family. How many opportunities do we get every day to be brotherly towards another person and tell them about the faith that we have? There was such a thing called a multi-generational survey on evangelism. Some 1,600 professing Christians were asked a range of questions, including one that said, what prevents you from sharing your faith? Nearly 1 in 4 said fear. People communicated back that they were afraid of losing valuable relationships and wanted to avoid the tensions that came with those kind of discussions. But brotherly love recognises that another person's salvation is not dependent on our performance, that God is at work in everybody's life, and our small conversations are just part of that process. Some plant the seed, some water it, but it's God that makes it grow. Last one in there was compassion. Deep inward feelings and genuine concern for someone else. Not much difference between that and sympathy. But both words have an emotional element that shows us that Christian behaviour must go beyond cold duty. Others should sense that we genuinely care for them. Compassion is tied with brotherly love. You remember the drink driving ad that ended up with the line, "Friends don't let friends drink and drive"? Well, Peter reminds us here that those small conversations about our faith are a result of compassion, because friends don't let friends go to hell. Harmony, sympathy, brotherly love, compassion and humbleness. It's an unusual quality, because almost every book you read deals with relationship, saying that you must learn to love yourself first before you can love someone else. The Bible clearly teaches that we must be lower, not raise our estimate of ourselves. Do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Peter goes on to show us that the good life is lived with good relationships and the right attitude and actions, and also lived with the right responses. Verse 9, he said, "Do not repay evil with evil or insult for insult." No matter how unjustly we might be treated, we don't retaliate. There's a book called "This Is How It Happened," and the writer asks a question: where does seeking justice end and seeking vengeance begin? I'll say it again. Where does seeking justice end and seeking vengeance begin? Not only a fantastic line in a book, it's also a very fine line to tread in life. In fact, it's way too fine to manage on our own. A Parks and Wildlife Ranger called an unlicensed fisherman in the act. He said, "You're going to pay a big fine for all those fish in your bucket." The man says, "But officer, I didn't catch these. They're my pet fish. I just bring them here to swim. When they're done, they jump right back in the bucket." "Really?" said the ranger. "This I've got to see. If you can prove it, I'll let you go." The fisherman empties the bucket in the lake and waits patiently. A few minutes go by and nothing happens. Eventually the ranger says, "Where are the fish?" And the fisherman says, "What fish?" Justice and vengeance. Do not say, "I will repay evil." Wait for the Lord, says Proverbs 20. Someone paraphrased it this way: we should not try to get our pound of flesh in our own way. Be like Christ. Peter wrote earlier, while being reviled, he didn't revile in return. That's another word we don't use very often, revile. It means being personally abused, defamed or maligned, While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. The right attitude and actions, the right responses, and now the good life is the life lived with the right incentive. Verse 12 says, "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." That's the incentive. God is watching. Just like the old Bette Midler song. God is watching you, except he's not watching from a distance. So the incentive in this verse is not that God is on the lookout for any time that we do wrong so that he can give us a heavenly smack, but rather that God is scanning our lives. He's watching everything in order that he might listen to our prayers. It's for our nourishment, not our punishment. What's being said is that it ought to be a great incentive to live like this. It ought to be a great incentive for us to live with the right attitude and the right responses, no matter how severe the persecution around us, no matter how unfair the treatment, no matter how difficult or painful the circumstances are. Peter is simply saying this: look, the good life can be lived this way. We don't have to retaliate. We don't have to get our own pound of flesh. We don't have to take vengeance in our own hand. We don't have to live that way. We can simply have the right attitude, a gracious and humble and sympathetic and harmonious attitude. We can give love back to our enemies, even though they give us anything but that in return. And then in verse 13, Peter asks, "And who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good?" In other words, that's the whole point about the incentive that he talks about. Who is ever going to harm you and take away the good life? Who's ever going to do that if you're zealous for good when God is watching over you and you're living the way that he called you to live? In the wisdom book of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon ponders many questions about life under the sun. Solomon had it all. He could easily have competed with any of today's celebrities. He had more money, more power, more notoriety, and he certainly had more women. And yet, he detested life. He spent years subscribed to the idea that living the good life meant living a life that set you free, that satisfied and fulfilled you, that added happiness, joy, and a sense of purpose to your life. And so when he came to the end of his life, he looked back over the whole thing, hated it all, because he lived for his own indulgence, his own self-centeredness. And at the end of the book, we read that he comes to the conclusion that could have saved him all the pain, all the trouble, if only he'd done this one thing first. Ecclesiastes 12:1 says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them." Solomon finally came to realise that all of the money, all of the accomplishments, all of the fame and all of the women, all of it, everything, brought him nothing. He said that was all vanity, emptiness. Because he knew the good life is the life that remembers God. Remembering is tough. I find that out every time I go to the supermarket and I get back home having forgotten one of the things I actually went there for. There's the old story of the man that wanted to catch the South Perth ferry. He's strolling along the foreshore when he suddenly realised the ferry's about to take off. He starts to run. His legs are pumping hard. His heart is pumping even harder. He grabs hold of his mobile and his wallet to make sure he doesn't drop them. And he's running even faster now. But before he can get there, the gate closes. The ferry engine drops into gear and heads off across the city without him. And he stands there at the barrier, gasping for breath, and somebody offers him some very unhelpful advice. "You should have run faster." The man thinks about it while he's getting his breath back, and he eventually replies, "I actually did run fast enough. I just didn't start early enough." And that's Solomon's point. Start remembering God early enough. If we expect to find true happiness in this life, we must connect to the living God through faith in Christ. Living the good life is tied up with good relationships, with the right attitude and actions and responses, with the right incentive. It's all that. But it's also more. It's also about recognising just who we are in relation to who God is. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. In other words, the sooner we do that in life, the more opportunity we have of living that good life. And that's the good news about the good life. It's never too late to live it. And we don't need to plough up the garden either, or even get goats or chickens to do it. Amen. Paraphrase part of Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3. As we leave, we ask to be strengthened by the Holy Spirit, that glorious inner strength that sustains us. And also that Christ's love will help us share with others the extravagant dimensions of his love, to reach out and experience its depth and its height, to live full lives, to live the good life, and all that entails. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Amen.